introduce myself. I'm Dave Woodward. I'm based up in the northeast of England, and I'm an advanced instructor, probably been diving about 26 years and teaching about 23, 24, I'm not sure. Thank you very much for taking the time to dial in today. I know there's a lot of BSAC webinars on. It does seem to be every other night for me at the moment. And as we're getting closer to getting back in the water, there's a number of sessions being run aimed at helping us get back in the water safely. So tonight, I'm going to talk about surfacing actions following a control buoyant lift or an AS ascent. There was a talk not so long ago by Jamie Heptonstall on the control buoyant lift and the AS ascent, which I'll be referring to, and I'll give you a link to that. But we'll have a look through the presentation, then we'll see if there's any questions at the end. Right. What we're going to talk about today is what contributes towards an effective rescue, and from the data that we have from the incident report, effectiveness of some rescue techniques. We'll look in more detail at the alternate air source ascent and also actions on surfacing from the alternate source ascent, and the same for the control buoyant lift. Right? In the world that we're in at the moment, there's a lot of, well, there's a bug going around, and you know, COVID very much bears a lot in what we're going to do in this area in terms of training and what we have to consider when we go diving. So we're going to talk about that a little bit, and I'll give you some references to more of these related webinars and more of the rescue information on the BSAC website. All right, if I'm talking too quickly, just please raise your hand, or if you can't hear me properly, just give me a shout. Okay, so today's talk, I'm looking specifically at the actions following an ascent, a rescue ascent, but I'd like to just step back a little bit and understand how what we do in the background and in the preparation can help us. All right. Obviously, training in the skills is very important, but also the experience to recognize when and how to use that training effectively. Yeah. It's nothing new that within BSAC and within club diving activities, we really do support organised diving with a sufficient capable people on hand, providing surface support, diving in a group who's going to guide you both in diving activities and provide support if something's to go wrong. Right. On top of that, personal rescue skills are vitally important. Right. Recognising that they need to be learned in the first place and practice regularly, both to keep up to date and to be familiar with the correct techniques, right? Because it's not that easy. That's why we do the training. Apart from those of us who are instructors, and assuming we actually get to go diving, how many divers regularly refresh these skills as often as we would like to, or get the opportunity? Perhaps your branch doesn't really spend a lot of time having a dedicated diving day for rescue skills and so on. Right. On top of that, we've got the buddy system, and it's very important in safe diving. Planning and preparing as a team with your buddy, right? Carrying out a good buddy check before going in, and maintaining, you know, an acceptable level of monitoring through the dive. It's all very important, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail later. Right. We have a good safety record. I was just looking back through some of the incident reports, and there's something like 300 to 400 incidents reported through the BSAC system a year, both in the UK and overseas. And of that, relatively few, maybe 10, 15 on average fatalities, right? And the number of incidents seems to be going down. Whether it correlates with fewer people diving, I don't know, but you know, there's a lot of work being going on in analysing the incidents and adjusting training to suit that and try and address the issues. Okay. Safety is achieved by a number of things, but if we actually concentrate, we're assuming that we have the management and the organisation in place. Let's think about how we're focusing on you and me as a diver, a pair of 2 or more divers, what we need to practice and demonstrate. Right, buddy checks. Right, how many times do you see experienced divers assuming that a buddy check they're too good for a buddy check, it's beneath them, right? Or it's just a quick formality that, well, we'll do a quick BAR before we jump in, without actually looking at your buddy system, without checking that everything's working, yeah? How good are your buddy checks, right? Are we same ocean divers? Or do we keep a level of contact and communication throughout the dive? Now, when I dive with my regular buddy, we do have a system where we're always in the corner of each other's eyes, and we can use signals. But I'm not guilty of analysing every move that he makes and waiting for him to do something wrong. So, is there a happy medium between just concentrating fully on your buddy and having just the barest of contact with them and communication? You know, do we understand what to look for? Odd behaviours, hesitations, yeah? Do we use our common sense when we're diving as a buddy pair? In 2018, I think it was, there was a review of the incident reports for the last 6 years, and looking at the data, they wanted to define the efficacy. Now, I'm not very good with that word, although we hear it on the news all the time with COVID, but really the effectiveness of the rescue techniques. And they collated this data from the incident reports and defining the successful outcome. We can see for an alternate source ascent and a control buoyant lift, were generally relatively successful. You can see the definition there. For an alternate source is the casualty reaches the surface without having to do a free ascent or just swimming for the surface. And for a control buoyant lift, the casualty reaching the surface. As we then move on to the resuscitation techniques, you can see that the actual effectiveness is much, much lower. But I think we're all aware that the introduction of oxygen into the training and the use of an AED, while it still gives us quite a low outcome, it significantly improves on CPR only resuscitation. All right, so with this in mind, a lot of things are incorporated into the diver training program. And this is just a quick slide. We'll diver training. At each certification level, we've got specific areas where we're looking at control buoyant lifts, alternate source, and more. So in ocean, we talk about it, and we start to do it in the pool, and then we start to do it in open water. Sports diver, it's getting more complex. In dive leader, it's getting deeper and harder. Advanced diver, and and then in the advanced lifesaver, I seem to remember it was a 20-meter lift, and then towing for 100 meters, which when I did it, I think was with a buddy and a twin set through surf for 100 meters, and that was still while we were doing rescue breaths in the tow as well. So it is getting progressively more advanced as we're going through the training. And something else of note to those people who are going for their open water instructor, control buoyant lift and basic life-saving or rescue breaths is actually a part of the instructor examination that you will be tested on the examination. So that's something that we need to consider when you're going towards your instructor qualifications and training, especially because this is something that you are then going on to teach people. All right, so in terms of recovery to the surface, we're looking at the two main areas that we're looking at: the control buoyant lift and the alternate source ascent, octopus ascent. I might slip into using the word octopus because that's what I've used for the last 20 odd years. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on the actual ascents themselves. There's a link here, and I'll show you the link a little bit later on where it is on the website. But there is a similar talk which is concentrating on the full skill with the alternate source and the control buoyant lift to the surface. So today we're going to be looking at what we do then. Now, I'll start with the alternate source. Alternate source is a backup system. I'm old enough to remember buddy breathing in the training. I'm not old enough to remember when we were going diving without an octopus. But it's a backup system. It's part of the buddy system, and being able to use it is an important skill. right? And it sounds easy, but it does take a bit of practice. We would like divers to make more consideration of having their redundant gas supplies, a pony cylinder, a twin set, whatever, you know, a stage cylinder. But being in the situation either as a casualty or a rescuer is probably not a planned event. So we need these skills to fall back on, right? I'm sure, like me, most of you have at some point been diving with a buddy and borrowed the alternate source. You know, swim around, maybe your air's getting a little bit too low, or you've got a convenient buddy with a twin set that you can just breathe off one of his regulators, and that saves you a lot of air for your second dive. But in reality, in a situation here where we're out of gas, this is an emergency. So the principle is that we've got to abort the dive and ascend safely. That's the most important thing, right? We'd like to be ascending together, right? Keeping this in mind, both with the traditional AS setup where you've got an octopus on a longer hose, whether it's coming over your left or your right hand, we need to be together. We need to be keeping together. Now, in relation to a long hose, I know they are popular. I dive with long hoses. So it's fabulous. You know, people say the story, I can give you a long hose and then you can go over there out of the way. You're not panicking in my face. But then be aware that you've potentially got a diver there who's in an out of air situation who can quite happily drag you up or down. So really trying to stay close together, trying to ascend as a buddy pair. That's very important. So we need to think about that. It's worth considering air consumption. Do you have enough gas? All right, just looking at our normal 25 litres a minute that we plan for, you know, bearing in mind we can generally do 15 litres a minute quite easily when we're diving. 2 divers at 30 metres, that's about 200 litres a minute, which is about 15 bars a minute in a 12 litre cylinder. So towards the end of a dive, that 15 bars a minute could disappear quite quickly, right? But saying that, is it a good idea to be planning a 30-meter dive with just your buddy's alternate source as your backup, right? As an aside, we're talking about 25 litres a minute. I've done bailout training, and when we measured it, it was quite stressful, and I was pulling about 65 litres a minute. So I don't think my buddy would be very happy with me coming up to him on a single cylinder and taking that amount of air out of his gas supply. So it's always important to remember when you're planning your dive within the system. Now, if we remember, if we're diving to our rule of thirds, at any point up until we turn around, we should always have at least twice as much gas as we need for one person to get back. But is that assuming that you're breathing normally and there's no stress? So think about that there. Think about your positioning and your grips. How are you going to hold on to each other? And this is often when we see teaching control, buoyant, lift and alternate source, the confusion. Ideally, if we use our right hand, then we have our left hand available to control our buoyancy, adding air, dumping air. All right, and we can keep a good firm grip with our right hand. Paddy has a similar system where they do the Roman handshake, where you clench your right forearm to right forearm. So you can control, you've got your left hand free to control your buoyancy, dump air from your suit on the way up. Okay, now Jamie's talk, which I'll link to at the end, that goes through in quite a bit more detail on this. So next we get up onto the surface, assuming that with our own gas, our own buoyancy source, as a rescuer, I should be quite happy and in quite a comfortable position. So I'm probably in a good position to take charge, right? We hope I've got my own regulator secure, so I can fill my BCD, maximize the buoyancy, and I can take a grip on the casualty and support the casualty with 2 hands, right? I'm giving him then an opportunity to orally inflate his BCD, and it could be because I'm supporting him or her, it could be with the regulator switching, or it could be using free air from the surface. But just be aware, you know, you may well need to intervene. They may not be able to do this. They've just had potentially a stressful ascent from depth out of air. all they may be concentrated on is breathing. So just be prepared to further support them with buoyancy, but also you may have to orally inflate for them. Right now, I think we practice this as part of the ocean diver training, but how often do we ever practice even orally inflating our own BCD? Right? It's also worth remembering the best way to keep somebody on the surface is to dump their weight. You know, this could be an emergency. Well, it is an emergency, and people don't often recognize that. So at every point in the training, we're stressing that in an emergency we can dump our weights, and it's going to keep us on the surface. But you can see in the incident reports over the years, people seem to forget to do this. All right, so we've got ourselves up on the surface, and now hopefully we've got a boat coming for us. We'll have the time to become a bit more comfortable, get the breath back, swim to shore. Do you assist them to shore? If they're out of air, if it's rough, perhaps swap into a snorkel to keep the face out of the water or keep the breathing out of the water. Do you have a snorkel? I'm going to move on to some teaching points, and I want you to think about this both as teaching it or perhaps when you're learning this skill back in your branch, right? The first thing I'll say, and this comes from back in the depths of time when I started doing this, we all dreaded going for our rescue drills, and for me it was heading over to Wastwater to do control buoyant lift and alternate source ascent in Wastwater, in cold water with lots of bubbles and lots of stress around, and very much you'd only really had a bit of a chance to practice this in the pool, right? So we all dreaded that. We're just expected to perform with very little practice, very little chance to try it out. And things have changed a lot over those years, right? It's still a stressful skill to master. So the onus is on presenting the skill as a lesson. It's not a drill, it's a lesson. We've got to build it up progressively. The student needs to be able to really master it before they demonstrate they can perform it at the required standard, right? Message here is take the time to teach this. Yeah, it's a vital skill and it's important to teach it, not just to expect them to perform. And this more than this and the control buoyant lift, more than anything else, mass clearing or anything, is the one that becomes more stressful for a lot of people once we start to be doing the open water lifts, right? Think about how in the diver training program, I did show you the slide, it's introduced at ocean diver, the lifts becoming progressively deeper as you go through the levels, right? But remember, it's repetitive, so we're trying to reinforce what they've previously done, but adding a little bit more depth, right? The surface in action, they should be the same. We'd expect more familiarity as you progress, but just giving them a chance to practice these things before you go out and actually do it as a lesson and spending the time there. Right? It's totally the part of the AS lesson, but think about how you can make it more effective than just running through the steps in the water. You know, be mindful of the weight of the equipment. Before you go in the water, think about the dry run. Right, the grip. We've done a buddy check, or we're going to do a buddy check so we know where the alternate source is. Can it be released? Is the hose rooted so you can breathe off it easily without it being pulled out of your mouth? Does it get in the way of your hands? Does it get in the way of your BC controls? Right, so doing that dry run on the surface, doing it on the shore, and you can do it on the surface as you get in the water. Orally inflating the BCD, how many times do you actually practice orally inflating the BCD in the water? Not very often, I'd say. All right, and when we do get in the water, you know, perhaps do this again in standing depth so we know what it's like when you're just floating in the water with your head close to the water. As an instructor, it's hands-on lesson. All right. You will be hands-on with a student. Usually you'll have more than one student. So remember a double demonstration. So the student can be both observing from outside and observing as part of the exercise. So each student gets a chance to see it delivered as an observer and as a participant. So we call that the double demonstration. And, you know, keeping safety at the forefront. Position yourself close enough to intervene. You may have to assist with buoyancy at some point. It's also good practice just to have your alternate source ready at hand. In case in the confusion, mouthpiece is dropped, you can offer it up, you can stick it in front of somebody's face if needed. Yeah, so just think about how we can bring safety into the lesson. Hopefully you're all still awake. I will then ask you a question. Now you can answer in the chat, and I think Mike will pick some of the chat questions. So the first question is, what are some of the actions that help us to maintain a good safety record? Anyone?
From Simon, Dave, always carry a buddy line just for AS. Careful planning, practice, communication, buddy check, practice, buddy check, training, practice, listen to Dave. Dry runs. I think they've got a planet, always plan for air. Buddy monitoring. I think they've got the majority of the good things there.
Yeah, so let's just look. I mean, these are some of the ones: dive management, training, practice, and experience. We saw that coming up. Appropriate equipment. I think I saw alternate air supply. It's very good if you have an alternate air supply. I know. At one point we used to have quite a few people turning up just with an auto air integrated into their BCD, which looks nice and streamlined, but it's not very good for actually sharing air. Sure, you dined up learning from mistakes.
Dive plan, polar anning.
Yeah, so yeah, that's good. That's good. Lots of things. Were you listening to me? Who should take charge when we're on the surface, ideally?
Rescuer. The rescuer.
The rescuer. Perfect. So somebody's listening. Quite a few people are listening. What are we talking about next? I'm just looking between my two screens. Where am I? Right. Sorry. The rescuer. That's correct. Control buoyant lift. This is a fun skill to teach, but it's also quite difficult to teach correctly. And we do spend a lot of time with instructors in development, working on the surfacing actions and the rescue breaths. Now, I'm going to recap a couple of important points. Actually, I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail on the control buoyant lift, and there's going to be a bit of repetition in here. Incapacitated or unconscious divers, thankfully, they're pretty rare. Yeah, but also think about other situations where the buddy, for whatever reason, really needs help to get to the surface. Something that's become more common knowledge, and there's much greater awareness of IPO, immersion pulmonary edema, manifestations of that. So we talked about awareness of your buddy earlier, and monitoring your buddy, looking out for things like difficulty breathing, for no reason, normal breathing, coughing, thinking about the regs not working properly for no reason. So again, we're looking at monitoring our buddy, right? So conscious, maybe a bit confused, maybe they need some help. When I was putting this presentation together, my wife reminded me of a time when she was running a training sort of expedition out into the South China Sea. On a boat, and she was taking a newly qualified diver who was quite panicky, and she ended up having to just assist them to the surface, nice and gently, a control buoyant lift. Think about being aware of your buddy, alert for any issues. We don't have to wait for them to pass out. If they need a bit of help, perhaps lost a mask. Yeah, if you've lost a mask, that could warrant some assistance somewhere between a general guide back up to the line or a control buoyant lift, or somewhere in between there. So thinking about that, now our priority is to get the casualty to the surface, right? We want to be ascending directly to the surface. May mean ignoring decompression stops, which is perfectly fine because DCI can be treated, and the divers Right, we recommend not to try and waste any time trying to replace a regulator in an unconscious casualty, or even if somebody's struggling to accept a regulator, bringing them up is very important. Now, we are assuming that the casualty is going to have gas, and as we train for it, we'll be lifting them using their own buoyancy. Now, it's important that we do it this way, because if we get separated, we're using their buoyancy, they'll go up, and at worst we'll go down and be able to get control, or at worst we'll just stay where we are, but they'll still be heading to the surface, so that's important. But think about, what if this isn't the case? All right, if you turn up and they've got no gas. So ideally they're relatively neutrally buoyant. So physically lifting them off the bottom and swimming them up a bit could be enough for any air that's present to start to expand, create some buoyancy, and they'd start to come up. In which case, you just need to be careful that you don't vent too much on the way up to lose that buoyancy. I think about a rebreather. If the lungs are flooded on a rebreather, it could be very heavy. I know I talk about my wife, but once she had a full suit flood in January in the Sound of Mull, the zip had totally gone, and bringing her up, she was very heavy. We had to use her buoyancy and my buoyancy to get her up. All right, so thinking about that, how are we going to get them up? Can we use their buoyancy? Do we need to think of an alternate source? Now, as a last resort, we really need to remember that we can drop their weights or use a crack bottle. But if we do that, it's going to be much harder to control the ascent. All right, so I know personally I tend to dive with pouches. So if you maybe drop one pouch, you're getting them up a bit easier without going too quickly there. Now, in terms of your ascent as well, just remember, this is probably going to be a faster than normal ascent. In the training, we're looking for control to show you've mastered the skill. But in a real situation, we may well have had a faster ascent. We may well have omitted some planned decompression stops. All right, and that just needs to be remembered, because when we get on the surface, we're dealing with two divers who've had a fast ascent. All right, so equally, if you've got somebody in your dive group that's happened to this, we need to keep an eye on the rescue as well as the casualty, especially when we're considering maybe applying first aid, oxygen, or evacuation. Right. Something else to think about is I don't know how many of you have read much into the nitrox and oxygen toxicity, but if, for example, the diver was suffering from oxygen toxicity and they could have been fitting or they could have been rigid, it's best to wait until they've relaxed as they go through that phase, the tonic phase, the clonic phase. Wait until they relaxed before you lift them, so we're not risking any lung damage as they come in. Okay. So once we get onto the surface, the priority here is we're keeping a good firm hand on the casualty, good firm grip. We've got to establish their buoyancy. So face clear of the water, fully inflate their BCD, right? And then remember to inflate yours. Right? Consider removing the weights. It's probably a no-brainer. If I've got an unconscious casualty there and I want them to stay on the surface, I will try and dump their weight belt. And even my own, although it does sometimes become a little bit harder to swim without a weight belt. But it's, again, outside of training, how often do we actually practice going to the shallow water and dump your weights? How often do we do that? Not enough. We've got as both safely on the surface, we're keeping a good grip. And then we're going to try and signal for help. Right? We can shout. We can blow a whistle. We can do a big, bold signal, arm outstretched, clearly waving, we need help. We'd like to think that we have an attentive skipper or shore cover that's watching for us, and help will come to us. All right. We would like not to shout for pizza. So remember, that's often something that people use when they're training in a crowded quarry is shout pizza. Sometimes we do the things that we've trained for, and we've got to be aware of that. So signaling for help. Now, if we decide that help isn't coming, how the casualty actually is defines what we need to do, or decides what we need to do. So conscious casualty, Again, we've brought them to the surface. They're probably stressed. So the important thing here is we're making sure that they're buoyant on the surface, making sure that they're secure, and then we're going to reassure them, whether we're waiting for the boat or, if necessary, assisting them, towing them to the shore. Unconscious casualty, they're going to be in a bit of a flap. So reassurance and keeping them safe and secure and trying to get them out of the water as soon as possible. For an unconscious casualty who's breathing, then we need to take the steps to help them breathe. So removing their mask, removing the mouthpiece. We've made them buoyant. We've made sure the face is out of the water, extending their airway. Right? This makes it easier for them to breathe. And again, we're keeping a good grip on them, and we can either monitor them while we're waiting for assistance, or we can tow them to shore. Right? And then in the worst case, with a non-breathing casualty, then we're going to need to remove the mask and mouthpiece and provide rescue breaths for a minute before proceeding to tow them to shore. Right? We're only going to be towing if there's no help coming to us. Right? The priority is to get the casualty out of the water. Right? So this is the idea behind performing the rescue breaths for a minute, and then we're going to set off to shore. Now we'll look in a little bit more detail at this. Going through it again. So put in a simple flow chart. We're starting, we've got a firm hold of the casualty, and we're going to maintain this throughout the rescue. It's very important we don't ever let go of the casualty. So make the casualty and yourself buoyant at the surface with their face clear of the water. Often people forget to make themselves buoyant, which then makes it more difficult for them to perform effective rescue breaths. We're going to shout for help. We're going to signal for help. It would be nice to think that somebody's watching and somebody's going to come and help. So we're going to shout loud. We're going to have our distress signal. Again, we're keeping hold of the casualty. We're going to extend the casualty's airway. Remember, they may be breathing, in which case this is going to help them. We've taken the mask off and taken the regulator out. Also, just bear in mind, with some BCDs, you may have to let a little bit of air out of the BCD just to be able to get a good neck extension. Right? It's often difficult with a wing sometimes, and even more so with a rebreather. But just be aware, just dropping a little bit out so you can get that neck extension there. So we'll extend the casualty's airway, and again, we will go into more detail. We're going to give the rescue breaths for a minute. So about 1 every 6 seconds gives us 10 rescue breaths, with the idea being that we're going to be getting some oxygen into their lungs and hopefully into their blood. Right? We're doing this on the hope that the heart is still breathing, and it's only been a problem with them. Heart is still beating. It's only been a problem with them breathing that's caused the issue. Right? So after that minute, without any further rescue breaths, if help isn't coming, then we're going to tow them directly to the shore. Right? When we get to the shore, we're going to dekit them and get them out of the water so that we can give more effective rescue breaths and full CPR on land or on the boat. Okay, so the priority here is to get them out of the water so we're in a good environment to be able to continue basic life saving. So we'll look at that again. Look at some of the key points. A firm hold, making sure we don't let go. Making sure both are buoyant and both secure on the surface. All right, there's a bit of repetition here. If you're finding to stay on the surface yourself, it's going to be harder to do it. Right? Opening up the airway with the good neck extension. If we're lucky, bringing them to the surface, removing obstructions such as the mask, it's possible they could spontaneously resume breathing. I'm not a medic, I'm not a doctor. I can refer you to some doctors who've got a lot more understanding of this, but this is how we're trained to understand it. So these are the actions that we want to do. Make it possible for them to breathe if they can breathe. And if this isn't the case, then we're going to deliver the rescue breaths. So we've opened the casualty's airway. Now, when we look at how people do the training on this, one of the faults is often the positioning. If you picture your casualty in the water, the head should be looking up with a good neck extension. And we don't want to twist the neck, so we would be trying to rotate the body as a whole so we can apply a good seal over the casualty's nose. We can roll, we can push the tank away underneath, we can push up on the other side. I'd like to say, don't try and push down on their closest shoulder because you're risking pushing their face under the water. So we're trying to roll the casualty, and if we've got our position correct, then their nose is going to be very easy to make a seal over. Right? It can be difficult with a wing, harder with a twin set, and then with a rebreather it can be even more difficult because you've got a lot of actual hardware there where you're wanting to put your arm to be able to get the neck extension. So we've removed the mask. We have a good grip, and we often call it the pistol grip, where we're able to provide the neck extension. We're not putting any obstruction or pressure on the trachea or the throat, and we're also able to try and seal the casualty's lips. So when we can supply a rescue breath via the nose, we've got a good seal on the lips, and the air is going to go into the lungs. Right? We want to tuck our forearm into the crook of the neck to be able to give good leverage for the neck extension. You know, it's not so good. You don't get good leverage if you've just got your elbow on their on the top of their shoulder. So getting your forearm in, as we see in the picture here, that gives you the good leverage to get the neck extension. It needs to be quite a strong extension. We're not trying to pull the head off, but it's very important. And we'll see a video shortly. So I'm running through this theory and repeating it a little bit, and I'm doing it quite gently. It needs to be taught and it needs to be practiced thoroughly hands-on in the water. So I'm just going to play a video of this, if it's going to work. And this is actually designed to help the people preparing for their instructor exam. And this is a demonstration of rescue breaths in the surface toe. What we've got here is we've got the exaggerated actions for teaching purposes. There's no sound, so as we've seen, there's a nice controlled lift to the surface. Got the casualty on the surface. All right, we're making ourselves buoyant, keeping hold of the casualty. Place the casualty on the back. We've got the casualty's face out of the water. Ditching the weights. Now, did you pay attention to where your buddy's weights are and how to ditch them, how to unclip them? Is the weight belt underneath a strap? How do we do this? How do we know how to do this? So they're now pretty safe and secure on the surface. Did you brief on how to ditch your own weight belt? We're giving a clear signal and we're shouting for help. You know, we actually want to see it nice and straight, that arm. Gripping the casualty. Holding onto that pillar valve, we can actually rotate the casualty there. Remove the mask. Here, as I said, just to get the neck extension, deflate the BCD a little bit. You can see here he's got his forearm in. He's got his pistol grip. He's not obstructing the neck, and he's sealing the mouth. And you can see here the neck extension being formed. Pushing on the cylinder, he can roll the casualty towards him. And this is where we generally need to have a few tries to get the right seal on the mouth. So a minute of rescue breaths. You see rotating, you know, in a real situation, he'd be a little bit lower in the water, but rotating the casualty so that you don't have to work too hard swimming up to make a seal on the mouth. And then he's towing the casualty in all in one go here. There's various different ways you can do that. One way I was taught originally was to actually tow them with the pistol grip, which keeps the neck extension on. But then you are getting quite cluttered up with your feet kicking them. Okay, so where are we now? Another quiz. You're still awake?
I am.
All right. What are the priorities upon surfacing? Do you want to answer in the chat?
Buoyancy, inflation, buoyancy, secure casualty, fully inflate BCD, both buoyant, buoyancy, fully inflate, buoyancy, call for help, buoyancy,
There we go.
weights, stop weights, help, make buoyant, secure casualty, buoyancy for both, weights reg mark, reassure.
Okay, so let's stop with that there. First things we're doing is we're making the casualty secure on the surface, we're making them buoyant and yourself, and we're calling and signaling for help. Yeah. If we go straight into doing the rescue breaths or straight into doing anything else, then we're delaying the chance of getting help, and then that just moves everything much further down the line. All right. How many rescue breaths would we administer before proceeding to tow the casualty to shore if we decided that help wasn't coming?
10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10.
10.
I think they got the idea. 1 minute. Ooh.
A minute, yeah. So it's 10 over a minute.
Yeah, we've got it there, 10 per minute.
Okay. I mean, it's a change. It was a change a few years back where we actually removed the recommendation to be actually towing and giving rescue breaths, and I'm sure there's many people on the call who can remember giving rescue breaths and then towing and stopping and giving rescue breaths and towing and stopping and giving rescue breaths, which was pretty hard work. But now, you know, it's quite simply, we're giving rescue breaths for a minute. If help is coming, then we'll continue with the rescue breaths. If help is not coming, then the priority is get them to shore, get them out of the water so we can do more effective basic life saving. Updated guidance on casualty recovery. Now, I just wanted to point this out. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but, you know, we have talked a little bit about how we, you know, we're hoping that we're diving in an organized manner with a group of people and with shore cover. And there's various ways of bringing a casualty out of the water. And we probably have more injuries training how to pull a casualty out of the water on our own than we do from casualties needing a control buoyant lift and basic life saving. So they've developed a technique for two people to recover a casualty safely out of the water. Not an instructor, ask an instructor, or ask the people at your branch, can we just get an update on this? I'm hopeful, I haven't seen it yet, but I'm hopeful that there is a video taken of this action as well as the pictures that we can hopefully have on the skill bites. Right, so it's worth looking up to there, and this presentation will be available on the BSAC website, and all of these links are in here. I'm sorry, it's quite small text, but they're all aware, they're all there, and I'll show you where you can find some of these videos. Now, we're going to move on to some teaching points. Again, a lesson, not a drill. It's a complex lesson. It's a difficult lesson to learn, let alone teach. Yeah. So it's important to take the time to teach it until we get to the point where the student is confident. All right. We looked at the DTP again. Think about the progression diver level. We introduced a control buoyant lift in the pool, and we did it at ocean diver. But as sports diver, we actually introduce the rescue breaths at sports diver. So again, we go back to the pool, and we introduce it in the pool in a controlled environment, and then we move into open water to do the control buoyant lift from, I think it's still from 6 meters at sports diver, to the surface, and then we're actually then doing the rescue breaths. So that's introducing that new skill and the tow, right? Alongside basic life supports also included in sports diver now, and oxygen awareness and AED awareness. Now, as we get onto the dive leader, it's becoming more complex because we're going from deeper. So we're going to be going from 15 meters up to 6 meters. And then we're going to stop at 6 meters, which in training is basically showing that we have control of the process. It's perhaps an idea to have a safety diver at 6 meters just in case things get out of control. And we're going to proceed to the surface, and then we go on and we have a slightly longer tow, but it's generally the same. Again, we're building up experience. We've done it before, and hopefully we've practiced it between the times we've been doing the training. Advanced diver, advanced lifesaver, again, it's going from 20 meters to 6 meters, and we're getting longer and longer tows. Beware of multiple ascents. Now, if you are teaching this, often it's effective when you've got more than one student. One-to-one's not quite as effective because it's more difficult to demonstrate it. So beware of multiple ascents. It's an idea to do this and the alternate source ascent early in the day before we've had a chance to get lots of nitrogen loaded in from a day's diving. So try and do this, early in the diving day when your nitrogen loading is low. I personally, if I'm going to be going and doing this sort of stuff, I'll do it on nitrox. Just that little bit of help from me there. Again, when teaching this lesson, we do what we call a reverse lesson. So the really complicated things are the surfacing actions. So the process between making them buoyant, calling for help, giving effective rescue breaths, and towing them. So we want to introduce this prior to going into the deeper part of the lesson. So we'll probably, when we go in, we'll start with this in standing depth, make sure we're getting the technique right, move into deeper water so we then see how it is when we're floating freely in the water. We're much lower in the water, and it's that little bit more difficult to get the mouth seal on the nose. And then once we're happy that everybody's done that, we can proceed to going down to wherever we're going to do control buoyant lift from, but doing the full exercise, knowing that we've already mastered the surfacing portion. So once we get to the surface, we can continue on and do the tow to shore. Again, and this is probably even more critical here, is the double demonstration. So when I'm teaching this, I need to be aware that I'm always going to have one casualty who's only hearing half of what I say because his ears are under the water. He can give me good feedback on his neck extension and whether the seal on his nose was good, or she can, and that's about it. So being able to rotate through your students so everybody gets a chance to observe, and probably everybody gets a chance to experience being a casualty, and everybody, of course, gets a chance to mimic and carry out the skill themselves. Obviously we've broken it down into manageable steps as we're teaching it, but these double demonstrations so everybody can see what's happening and everybody gets a chance. Again, it's also important. Now this is a skill where we're more likely to need to intervene, and it's more critical that we have a good view and we're able to observe the different parts of the skill. So we need to know if the neck extension is good, and we can only do that if we can see the neck extension. We need to see that the seal is good. We need to be able to see this, right? So your instructor positioning is very important, as well as the position of the other students, so they can see these critical aspects. So very important here to just make sure that everybody can see, and particularly you as an instructor can see and make any corrections, because with a lot of skills in diving, what happens if you don't get the skill right and it's deemed acceptable at this point, then you carry on with that skill for a long time, and sooner or later it becomes embarrassing when somebody points out that you're getting it all wrong. So it's important to make sure that as an instructor they really do nail this skill, because it's a very, very important skill. All right, I'm going to move on a little bit to where we can go on the BSAC website to get more guidance on this. On the main web page, I think this is available whether you sign in or not. The section is bsac.com.safety, and we can click on that, and we've got here, scroll down, we've got the basic life support guidelines, and you follow another link, and here we've got a number of different things, but what I'm looking at here is make sure you're current and up to date by looking at BSAC's basic life support guidelines. All right, so there's a link to the Resuscitation Council, which BSAC, among many other bodies, work with them on the updated guidance as it's made. But then we have to then translate that to what works effectively in the water situation, in the diving situation. So if you go follow that, it's going to bring you to this document here, which is the basic life support guidelines. The link is there, but again, this presentation will be made available. So what we're looking at here is it's outlining the techniques and the principles of rescue, and the specific recommendations for life support in the diving environment that can differ from life support or basic life support, basic life saving on a random person who collapses in the street or in the shopping mall. So it's very much worth a read, as it explains the differences and how we've arrived at our recommendations in this area. And while we're looking at guidance, I did mention, you know, we're living in this COVID world. Hopefully we're coming out of it, but we know that for the next year or more, there's still the considerations we've got to be making when we're coming to carrying out our activity in a safe manner while also dealing with a world that's got COVID. All right. So things to ask yourself: we are fit to dive, aren't we? All right. There's guidance on the website, and you can talk to your diving officer and your instructors on what to do if you've had COVID, in terms of the requirements for getting signed off for a medically fit to dive. But generally, if we made the decision to be going diving, then we're aware of these issues. We're aware of the COVID issues, and whether it's a formal or an informal risk assessment we should have been making, where we've accepted these risks, we've decided that we're going to be going diving with the chance that we may have to perform some life-saving activity. All right. With that said, a hell of a lot of work has been done on looking at the guidelines from the government and trying to work out the safest way that we can execute diving, diver training, rescue resuscitation, while minimising the risk from COVID. So I'm just going to look at a couple of documents. Now, there's a number of documents on the website, the COVID-19 safe diving guidance, and you know, I actually get every time the government issues a new strategy or a new roadmap, etc., then we start getting the calls in. So when can we go diving? What does BSAC say about when we can go diving? You know, first and foremost, you know, the first step here is we follow the government advice, and then within that government advice, there's a lot of good-looking, clever people who are interpreting that to make sure that any activities we do can be carried out within that advice and in as safe a manner as possible. And if it's not possible, then we don't recommend doing it, because the government advice first and foremost in safety. As we go into the guidance, there's a number of documents here. This medical guidance here, this is what I briefly referred to. If you have had a case of COVID, then you know the requirement is that you actually go through, you declare it on your medical declaration, and then follow the details and the guidance on there, and getting in touch with a medical referee, either for a phone consultation or an in-person consultation. There's a number of bits of guidance, because very first thing that opened up was shore diving, and then small boats and large boats. So there's guidance on how we can safely do normal diving activities, how we can look after equipment, rescue CPR, how we can do diver training. All right, I'll just jump into that here. So the rescue and resuscitation guidance here, worth a read, definitely. And this is where we have a slight difference in terms of what we are recommending that we do, which differs from the current General Resuscitation Council guidance, which is in a person on the street who keels over and you're going to be doing basic life saving. Now, the recommendation is, because of COVID, it's most probably, I'm not a doctor, cardiac arrest and chest compressions, only basic life saving, is pretty effective, while also minimizing the risk of transmission of COVID or getting infected with COVID. And that's the general recommendation for the man on the street. There's a lot more detail in the document. In the diving situation, The analysis is, the basics of the analysis is that a cardiac arrest is pretty rare, and generally as a result of something else, such as a respiratory arrest that's caused it. And so the guidance for divers is that rescue breaths are still a vital action to take, but also bear in mind we've made the choice to go diving. We've made the choice to go diving, accepting the risks, and have made that risk assessment. Right. So, you know, personally, if I'm going to be going, if I've decided to go diving with my regular buddy, then I've decided that I'm prepared to take the risk to provide rescue breaths. Now, in the risk assessment you're going to make, and this is for anybody who's capable or trained to deliver CPR, you know, what is your personal attitude balancing the risk of infection versus saving a life? What is the available PPE? You know, we like to use the face masks or the little shields, but they're not quite as easy to use when we're in the water. Right. What's the assessment? What's the likelihood? Assessment likelihood that we're going to require rescue breaths inclusive CBR? We'd like to think it's not going to happen, and as I said earlier, the actual incidence of these is extremely small. But just being aware that it's needed. What's the response time if we need emergency services? Will somebody come along with proper equipment that they can provide basic life-saving safely, quickly, easily, etc. So thinking about these risks, you know, my basic message here is the guidelines are here. There is a recommendation that in a diving emergency we will be carrying out rescue breaths, or we should be. And you know, and as I add to that, we've made the decision we're going to go diving. It's part of the risk that we know about when we make that decision that we're going to go diving. A little bit different in the diver training guidance, all right, and the document here, it does talk about the efficacy, but I don't like that word, so I'll say the effectiveness of the rescue techniques, and we already looked at that. And it identifies the COVID-sensitive activities such as the dry runs and the buddy checks and the briefings where we would be close up to somebody, possibly. So, for example, dealing with an alternate source, the recommendation is that if I get kitted up, my kit's all been sterilized, we hope, and during the buddy check, I'm not going to personally breathe off my alternate source because that could be something my buddy's going to use. So I find another way possibly to purge it or get my buddy to breathe off it. And then when it comes to rescue breaths, and this was a little bit of a head scratcher, but eventually we came up with an acceptable alternative methods for while we're still in this whole bizarre situation. All right, so as we saw, basic life-saving features in each diving qualification from sports diving onwards. So not being able to do this has an impact where effectively we would not be qualifying divers, and if we're not qualifying divers, then divers would probably not want to go through the training without the qualification. So as a temporary measure, we have some alternates, right? And the first alternate is to simply do simulated rescue breaths, and this could be onto a mask or onto the casualty's forehead. All right. We'd like to think that in the water we're very much minimising, with a lot of the water around the fresh air, we're minimising the risk of infection there. But this is under the understanding that we're going to make a firm commitment that as soon as physically possible, when everyone's had the jabs, when things have got a little bit back to normal, we will then repeat the training using the proper technique. Yeah, so that needs to be an understanding between the student, the instructor, and the branch that they will, you know, we can do it with this simulated technique, but we're going to go back and we're going to repeat that as soon as possible. Now, to reinforce this, perhaps after we've done the simulated rescue breaths, we get them out onto the shore and we give them some time with a resusciani actually working on rescue breaths. All right, just to try and reinforce it in the mind that the last thing we want them to be doing in an emergency situation is blowing on somebody's forehead. Right. Another option is to use an in-water mannequin, which is basically a waterproof resusciani. The problem with this is they're not cheap, and our recommendations with respect to the resuscitation mannequins is that we should be changing the lungs out and sterilizing between each student. So if you have more than one student, feasibly we could need 2 or 3 or 4 of these mannequins, and then replacing the lungs, etc. It can be quite expensive. And a final alternative we have here is to use somebody from your own household, with the understanding that it is extremely recommended that there are a trained diver. Yeah, I mean, it's easy enough to stick somebody into a BCD and a dry suit and throw them in the water to act as a casualty. But if we look at the risk assessment of the whole situation, it is much clearer that we need somebody who's actually had some basic diving training to be in that situation, even if they are just being used as a casualty for demonstration purposes. But this has given us an opportunity to continue, when we're allowed to go diving again, to continue the rescue breath training as much as we can, and to continue diver training. All right, so it's just how we have to be flexible for now, remembering once this is all over, we hope to come back, and we're committing to come back and catch up with more in-depth full training on the rescue breaths. And again, just moving on to the general diving guidance, I showed you the shore diving and the boat diving guidance. They contain a lot of it's common sense, but recommendations on how we can maintain social distancing, how we can position ourselves for dive briefings and buddy checks, even down to how we can fit people on a boat in a relatively safe manner to reduce any risk. So well worth a read, especially in the next 2 or 3 weeks as we're all dying to get back in some cold, muddy quarry while the seas are getting ready to warm up nicely for us. All right, so a few questions. This isn't a quiz, but a few questions for you from this. In the last 12 months, or given it was strange, in the last 20 months, outside of training, think about this. Have you actually done this, either training or real, in the last 12 or 24 months? Right? As we're getting out of the water again. Sorry?
Okie dokie. So we've got some answers coming through.
Okay, yeah.
If I'm trying to save someone's life, I'll worry about COVID later.
Yep.
No different to HIV in an emergency. Do we really think of these? Daniel James, yes. Daniel James, he's been lucky. William Cave, yes, before any club expedition. John Neals, no. For myself, when we go on expeditions with our club, we do a rescue session with all the club members going on the trip. Make sure they're all up to skills.
Excellent.
Fiona McMurray, daughter and son would practice these skills in the pool. Daniel James spent 2 months in Malta, doing it all the time. Our club has a rescue session every year as well.
Excellent.
So some good practices going on.
I managed to sneak in the last dive before, I think it was the day before lockdown, and I said to my mate, I said, can we just have a quick go doing a control buoyant lift? And the answer was, oh no, I just want to enjoy my dive. How often does that happen? Yeah. And some people, their clubs, they don't get an opportunity to do this, so it's something that's very important, not just teaching it, but refreshing these skills. So as we return to diving, like I say, we're probably for the first couple of weeks going to be limited to diving in some sort of quarry environment or something. Is it an opportunity to practice? I don't think we're going to be getting in the swimming pools for a month or two, but you can enjoy your first couple of dives, getting your buoyancy right, rediscovering the 6 different types of mud and weed that you missed for the last year or so. But taking the chance just to refresh these skills, so when the diving season does hopefully kick off in May, June, July, we're ready to go out there and do it safely. And also these return to diving webinars. There's I know Jim Watson from HQ. He's delivering some really good ones on a Saturday morning, where we're really looking at how we're preparing our divers and our branch because we're going back to diving in the next few weeks, hopefully. Now I referred to this earlier, and yeah, there's no chance anyone's going to write down these numbers very quickly. So I might actually see if I can put these links into the chat before we sign off today. But this is the presentation by Jamie Hepton-Stowe, expertly filmed in his back garden or prepared in his back garden, looking at the key aspects in a similar level of detail of the actual alternate source and the control buoyant lift, concentrating on the in-water activity in there. So it's well worth seeing that if you haven't seen that. And there's also a number of other webinars that we have here. Let me just click again. So on the training section of the BSAC website, we have the catch up on past training webinars. And as we scroll down, we have what we call the, among other things, there's the dive leader training there, but we have the skill bites. And there's a number of skill bites here. Diver rescue sequence. I should have watched that before I did this. Alternate source control buoyant lift, going boat diving, etc. So there's some really good webinars, and I'm struggling to keep up with the actual number of webinars just within the BSAC world that are being created and put out there. It's getting harder and harder as we're catching up with more things on getting back to diving. So it's almost time for a summary. I appreciate it's been quite a long hour, so I'll try and wrap this up so we can get into some questions. And just recapping now, we talked about an effective rescue, and we talked about how dive management, skills and experience, personal skills and buddy skills all contribute to an effective rescue. Right. And looking at the effectiveness, we can see that the lifts are relatively simple. Control buoyant lift and the alternate ascent, our alternate source ascent are, we've got a pretty good success rate as we define it, 70 to 80%. But when we're getting into the basic life saving, it's a much lower success rate. But remember, you would never even get to that point if we hadn't effectively removed the casualty to the surface and got them safely on the surface to be able to start to work on them with basic life saving. Reviewed the alternate source ascent and the actions on surfacing. So we looked at the priorities there. Basically we've got a buddy who should be relatively conscious and happy, so we're really just assisting them, making sure that they're secure on the surface and they can inflate their BCD. We moved on to the control buoyant lift, which is actually quite a bit more complicated, and we talked about the surfacing actions in terms of what we can do with a conscious buddy with reassurance, an unconscious breathing buddy, so making them secure and towing them back, freeing their airways, and then an unconscious buddy where we'd actually work into rescue breaths. And we talked about and looked in a little bit more depth about some of the techniques on the rescue breaths and some points, and then removing them either onto a boat or to the shore with a tow. And finally, I did show you there's a lot of information on the BSAC website. It is getting better and better every year, and the sheer volume of good information on there, it's worth just browsing in. And I will put the links that I have into the chat on this after I finished talking here, and so we can have a look at those references if you want to copy that. All right, so now that's it for me, and I'd like to, if we can open up the microphones, and then we can perhaps either have any very easy questions, or if anybody has, what would be good if anybody has an experience of this that they would like to share with us.
Yeah, just 1 second. I will release the microphones. Okay, everybody's now free to unmute. Please, one at a time, because Dave's head will explode. He is a northerner.
Just one question, Dave. Really enjoyed that. Brilliant. the old skill of buddy breathing, which I've only done a couple of times, where you sort of take 2 breaths and then hand it over. Do you think it's still worth practicing that?
It was removed from the diver training program. The key reason it was removed was because you tend to do what you've learned and what you've trained to do. And there was actually, because it's actually a more complex skill, you spend more time training to do the buddy breathing. And there'd be a lot of situations where we have a perfectly good octopus and people would go straight for buddy breathing. I did it myself. You know, my very first out of air situation, first thing I did was take the regulator out so I could buddy breathe. And it took me a minute then to realize I had an octopus. And then I'm going back 20 odd years. So over time, between that, the familiarity from the intense training, because it was more intense training than it was for using your octopus, and also I think they worked out that more people were being injured training than were being needed to use it in real life. That said, for playing in the pool, for when you're already a trained diver and you're wanting to use it as a confidence exercise, it is a great thing to be using as a confidence building exercise. I'm not sure people get to spend as much time in the pool just doing these things as we used to do. But in diver training, you know, it was moved from buddy breathing to alternate source ascent for a very good reason.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, myself, Dave, I was like you. I'm an oldie. I was taught buddy breathing. We were taught buoyant ascents. It's all gone back to being safe, safe, safe. It was a lot of skills, a lot of practice. I still do it with my students now and again to show how it used to be and how the new systems are a lot easier, a lot simpler, a lot safer. Yeah,
I remember happily, you know, 5 or 6 of us around a cylinder on the bottom of the pool and just going around in a circle. But I guess we don't get the pool time anymore.
No.
Any other thoughts? Does anybody have any experiences that they'd like to share?
Hi, Dave. It's Duncan from Chelmsford.
Hello.
Sorry, is someone else coming in? No? I'll carry on. One thing, I was diving last year. I'm a sports diver at the moment, looking for a dive leader. When I was out in Tenerife last year with Atlantic divers, you know, the BSAC Tenerife site, I've normally worn my computer. Yes, I'll admit I've only got one. That is one of the next pieces of kit to be got to get a second one. But I've normally worn that on my right hand. When I was out in Tenerife, they said, no, have it on your left. And we were doing alternative ascent.
Yeah.
Just for practice. You know, I was controlling me dry suit buoyancy as well. But doing an alternative lift. And Jeff pointed out, yeah, have it on your left hand because your right hands are moving around all over the place and you can't probably see your computer. Any ideas?
Well, I wear it on my. Let me just work out this hand, which is.
That's your left, Dave.
Right, yeah, I get confused. Well, even without the cameras.
That's your left, Dave.
So I wear it on my left hand, so I haven't had a problem. Because I wear a watch on my left hand because I was always brought up to say that you're working with your right hand and you can have a look at your watch on your left hand. Now, sometimes I'm using it. I mean, I prefer it on the left hand. On my rebreather, the cable comes down on my left hand. There are some people who prefer it on the right hand. But generally, I'm going to be using my right hand for more things, and my left hand is going to be for dipping my arm to dump from my dry suit and for maybe using my deflator hose. So it kind of makes sense for me to use it on my left hand because I can quite easily see it while I'm otherwise occupied with my right hand. Now, the only time when that becomes a little bit more difficult is when we're doing a control buoyant lift.
I was just going to say, if I can offer an opinion, an alternative opinion, I put it on the on my right hand, and I put the computer facing on the inside of my arm, specifically for that reason you just mentioned, that when you're doing a CBL, for example, and you're holding the deflator to remove the buoyancy, you can concentrate on your computer, the mouthpiece of the BC, but also your heads up, also looking at the surface as well. So you have that little triangle between the casualty's head, your computer watching your ascent, your your vent from the BC, and you can see the surface. I mean, it's only an opinion, mind. So
Yeah.
you know, there's not a right and wrong way really to do it.
So
I mean, I generally have to have a second one on the other arm anyway,
but for me, Dave, as well, when I do a control point, then I'm left-handed, so my computer is on my right wrist facing inwards, exactly the same as Stephen's. But I find when I'm holding onto my casualty, my right hand is locking onto their shoulder strap, their BCD, it's locked. I've got view of my computer. My left hand can then operate their
No, but you
gauge
need your right hand. You always need the right hand.
Sorry, left hand's holding them, right hand's controlling their BCD inflator. I can see it.
Correct.
If I'm doing alternate source, I'm holding on with my right hand onto their BC, and I can control my own.
Yeah.
And I can still see
it
my
on the
computer.
inside.
Yes.
Having it on the inside of your wrist.
Yeah.
I think what I actually sometimes do is have the bigger computer on the back and a dive timer on the inside of the wrist. But I mean, I personally often, if I'm using one, it usually just from habit ends up on my left hand.
But I think, well, like everyone says, it's personal choice and what works for you. There is no set standard of where you should or where you shouldn't. It's what works best for you, and it's practical.
Yeah, I agree with that. But it was just a thought that came in. And yeah, sorry, I should have said where it's on my left hand, and they suggested the right hand. But yeah, I suppose the next piece of kit, I get another computer and have one on each inside of each hand, so I can see it both ways.
Or a cheap dive timer.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot. Anyway.
But I mean, a question for the rest of the audience is: who's actually thought about it until we bring it up in a discussion like this, and thought about the reasons?
Or have everybody just picked up on what their instructor taught them to do?
Yeah. Or like I've done for the last 20 odd years until I started strapping extra ones on. It's on my left hand because that's what I'm used to looking at.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Any other questions?
Davey, yeah, can you put it in, Davey? Hi, I'm Steve from a 206 Rice Slip. I've always had a query. Let's start from the beginning. When I was doing my ADI, I'm a sports diver now, but I'm going with. When I've done my ADI, I had to do the controlled buoyant lift, and I was taught to hold my inflator, hold him by his strap hard, neck up, so his neck is always stretched. So he's a neck extension. My left hand, I controlled my buoyant lift very slowly. But the instructor, Yamas, told me, he said, you don't have to do that if it's not in the book. What's your thinking on that? Because you emphasised on the top neck extensions. So I thought if you're doing a 20-minute CBL, a 20-metre CBL, to let the air out as you're coming up in his lungs. What's your thinking? Do you need to stretch their neck or not?
This had been discussed quite a long while back, and there's a number of things that as they simplify it to make it effective, which is getting them out of the water. People have talked about that, and it does make sense. But I think they worked out that generally the air would escape. From memory, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, and that, you know, the priority is getting them up in a controlled manner. But if you start to think about, you know, you remember people saying, oh, you put this arm over here so the dry suit will dump, and so on. It's kind of, sooner or later, your task load to the point where you're never going to be able to control them going up. And I have seen it discussed, and I do remember it being discussed, but it was to the point that when they've looked into it, they've decided, and I can follow up and check if there's anything else behind this. They've decided that generally it doesn't make that much difference.
That's my conclusion as well. But originally I was taught that, but I'm now realising, I've been diving for 12 years now, and every single year there's an update, which is, it's not always right or wrong, it's different. And like you say, I was taught neck extensions. It's not been proven, it's not in the book, but should I do it? Because I don't believe it makes any difference on the outcome, because I'm going up controlled, I'm going up very slowly. So should I keep on doing it or not?
Well, I mean, almost the amount of effort that concentrates on getting the procedures that what actually goes into the book has to be safe. They're not doing it because it's easy, they're doing it because it works. And that's an important consideration. And something you mentioned here, as these things change, one of the, other than this is a wonderful thing to come out of COVID, is all of these webinars and the information sharing. But as you experienced, one of the best opportunities, or one of the only opportunities that the BSAC and the instructor training people get to actually check and update these skills is when people come from their own branches. They come onto the central events, either SDCs that are run centrally or onto the instructor training scheme. And it is actually part of that we do, you know, on the quiet, introduce these updates on the training and checking that everybody's up to date with these rescue techniques as they progress through their instructor development. And, you know, it's kind of a catch-all where we come across all sorts of crazy things.
I do understand the
and it's not a crazy thing, but yeah.
I do understand the catch-22, but you made the reason why I'm saying this is that you made when you got somebody at the top, buoyant, you was buoyant, got rid of their weight belt, you did say make sure the neck is extended. Now, what difference would it make if they were on the top? Because surely if the air was going to expand, you know, that's why I say we should extend the neck from 20 metres upwards. But in the book, it doesn't say that. And not one instructor said you should do it or I shouldn't. This is what is the question. So, and you're saying it's not proven. Is it proven or not?
Well, I mean, from what I remember, the analysis was that not doing it wasn't proven to be an issue.
I see. I find it's no time consuming or anything.
I mean, something else to think about is, you know, when we're doing the neck extension on the surface, we're making it easier for air to come in.
Yes.
But generally, unless there's a real obstruction, air is generally going to be coming out.
Yeah, you can't swallow if your chin's down, can you? So that's right. Yeah, I understand.
But you can still breathe out.
Yeah.
But it's really about making it as easy as possible and extending that tongue, that lax tongue, once you get them up on the surface.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Did that confuse you more? Okay, so there's a couple of comments on there that we don't use it or train it, which is pretty much basically what's in the book.
I think that one's about done. Dave.
Okay. Any other questions or thoughts?
Not a couple of comments coming in still on the medical thing, but nothing overly problematic.
Yeah, I mean, the general consensus is on the surface, the neck extension is essential. Underwater, you know, the neck extension on the surface, because we're wanting to get air into the casualty. underwater, from what I understand, I'm not a medic, it doesn't stop. If we don't have a neck extension, it doesn't stop air coming out unless it's a severe problem. But you know, it's not really encouraging air to go in as well, or water to go in. Okay, anyone else? I've put some of the links into the chat if you can find them in the chat if anybody just wants to copy them.
Have a quick look at the comment from Daniel James.
I know.
But no major comments.
Dave, could I ask a question, please?
Sure, yeah.
Sorry, it's just I can't post to everyone on the chat. If you are thinking of the CBL at the surface prior to doing the rescue breath, are we still advised to check inside the mouth in case there's anything loose in there, or?
I mean, this is what we've got in the basic life safety on the surface, but we're not expecting anything to be in there.
But I'm just thinking if the regulators come out of the mouth, anything could have potentially gone in there, or?
Yeah, I mean, if the regulator has come out of the mouth, or they swallowed the mouthpiece, or they swallowed their teeth. The general thing, the general message that we got was, it's a lot less liable than like on the surface where we'd find somebody at first we're checking it unconscious because they're choking on something, and we just, you know, the difficulty in doing that. I remember it used to be, are we going to assess if they're breathing or not, and then they worked out that 50% of medically trained people often can't work out if somebody's breathing or not. So it's not contained in our recommendations as such, but possibly more on when you're in the situation on the surface. I mean, looking in somebody's mouth and trying to fish something out with a pair of wet gloves on is quite difficult, I think.
Thank you.
But I'll see if I can get a better opinion on that for you. There's a comment on from Mark Lawrence. You know, it's all about practice. Practice, practice, practice.